No matter how much Donald Trump tries to convince us otherwise, Iran has officially claimed its rights to the Hormuz Strait today and announced the introduction of a toll for all ships, despite the position of the United States of America. Behind the backs of the negotiating teams, Oman and Iran secretly reached an agreement and are now pushing a plan that could radically change the rules of navigation through the Hormuz Strait. Now Oman is also insisting on a toll for ships, and let me remind you, the Hormuz Strait is divided between Iran and Oman. Although officially they are talking about voluntary contributions, in Tehran they do not hide the fact that they consider them a mandatory payment. Donald Trump boasted today about successful negotiations with Iran, while Iran itself put forward new demands to the US for signing a final peace deal. After the United States and Iran agreed to stop mutual strikes and hold consultations in Qatar on shipping issues in the Hormuz Strait, the situation became complicated again due to Tehran's position. Iran stated that it would not negotiate with high-ranking representatives of the United States, but the problem for Washington is that while Trump was boasting about his successes, an agreement had already been reached behind his back. In this episode, we will also analyze the shipping data in the Hormuz Strait, and it shows that it is still very, very far from pre-war levels. Meanwhile, US Vice President J.D. Vance stated that America still has plenty of trump cards up its sleeve that they are ready to use against Iran. But the US is also ready to settle for a partial success in the war. Right now, negotiations are taking place between the US and Iran in Qatar, so let's discuss the latest news, as they say, straight from the field. My name is Alexei Pichi. Let's discuss these topics together, but before we start, I ask you to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and leave any comment under this episode. And also subscribe to my Telegram channel Peachy News, the link is in the description of this video. There we publish breaking news as it comes in. So let's start, of course, with Iran. US President Donald Trump, commenting on the negotiations with Iran, stated that Washington is getting along very well with Tehran. According to him, the recent meetings in Qatar went very well. Next is a quote from Donald Trump. The denuclearization of Iran is progressing well. They had very good meetings, but we'll see. We definitely need to talk a bit more about these meetings, because in fact they didn't actually happen, but for Trump they went well. I should note that on Wednesday, the US and Iran held technical talks in Doha. The parties discussed the flow of ships through the Hormuz Strait and the issue of a ceasefire. On Wednesday, Trump's envoys Jared Kushner and Stephen Witkoff met with the Prime Minister of Qatar, who is the mediator in the negotiations. Although initially Trump announced direct talks with Iran, but direct talks did not take place. And it is precisely the Iranians' unwillingness to hold direct talks with American representatives that indicates that Tehran is playing a parallel game and, let's say, following a parallel diplomatic track. Let me remind you that on Tuesday, Iran stated that it does not intend to hold meetings with high-ranking representatives of the United States who arrived in Qatar. Those were Witkoff and Kushner. Such a position by Tehran complicates the prospects for reaching a long-term peace agreement between the countries. And now Iranian officials have stated that before discussing more complex issues, particularly possible restrictions on the nuclear program, the parties must settle all the terms of the ceasefire agreement that was reached 2 weeks ago. This includes lifting sanctions, lifting the blockade, unfreezing Iranian assets, and so on. These statements indicate that Washington and Tehran are still far from reaching a compromise on key issues. And a preliminary framework agreement. It stipulates that Iran must refrain from blocking the Hormuz Strait in exchange for financial incentives. After that, the parties will have 60 days to negotiate a permanent peace agreement. So, out of those 60 days, 2 weeks have already passed. US President Donald Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner and Special Representative Stephen Witkoff arrived in Doha for talks that the White House called high-level meetings between высокого уровня. At the same time, the authorities of Iran and Qatar reported that the American representatives would only be in contact with intermediaries and not directly with the Iranian side. And calling these high-level meetings is incorrect. And this is where things start to get really interesting. Iran has already declared control over the Hormuz Strait. Shipping through the Hormuz Strait partially resumed after the war. However, Iranian officials insist that control over ship movements will be exercised jointly with Oman, which is located on the opposite shore of the strategic strait. In addition, Tehran announced its intention to introduce a fee for ship passage starting in mid-August, after the completion of a 60-day negotiation period. And in fact, if we look at the Memorandum of Understanding, Tehran has every right to do this, and Trump signed off on it. And here I will quote the chief Iranian negotiator, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf. Sovereignty over the Hormuz Strait belongs to Iran and Oman, and traffic in the strait is regulated by agreements determined by Iran. And despite this uncertainty, oil prices still fell after the weekend events, when the US struck Iranian military targets in response to drone attacks on American commercial vessels. And Iran also attacked American military bases in Kuwait and Bahrain. At the same time, the UN Conference on Trade and Development warned that even after energy markets stabilize, the most vulnerable economies may continue to suffer greatly from rising food and fuel prices. They say that things won't recover just like that. It will take a lot of time. The war has already led to an acceleration of global inflation. The law on oversight has increased political pressure on Donald Trump ahead of the US midterm elections in November, the results of which will determine control over the US legislative body. Trump himself and US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent have already called on fuel sellers within America to lower gasoline prices. They say since oil prices have dropped, gasoline prices should be lowered too. Although it's very strange when the Treasury Secretary makes such calls because he understands perfectly well that the same gas station chains, well, they're now selling the gasoline that was purchased during the period when oil prices were much higher. But before they get to the current prices, well, it's going to take some more time. And this temporary agreement between the US and Iran also provides for a cessation of hostilities between Israel and the Iran-backed group Hezbollah in Lebanon. However, it's deadly. The Speaker of the Lebanese Parliament, Nabi Berri, who is an ally of Hezbollah, expressed doubts about the separate framework agreement between Lebanon and Israel, which was brokered by the US just last week. Analysts note that such an agreement may only cement the current standoff, since the withdrawal of Israeli troops from southern Lebanon is directly linked to the disarmament of Hezbollah. But still, the main stumbling block at this stage of the negotiations is the Strait of Hormuz. There is something that Donald Trump is not in a hurry to talk about publicly yet, although he knows about it very well. And it's not for nothing. I mentioned a bit earlier that Iran is playing its own parallel game. While Trump assures everyone around him that things are going great for him, that he gets along very well with Tehran, but Tehran is playing its own game. Oman and Iran are now advancing a joint plan that could radically change the rules of navigation through the Strait of Hormuz, one of the world's most important maritime routes. After the end of the American-Iranian war, it was Muscat who proposed introducing a fee for using the strait. And although officials in Oman say that these are voluntary contributions, in Tehran they openly admit that they consider them to be an effectively mandatory payment. They claim it's voluntary, but if you don't pay, you can't pass through the strait. Officially, no one is demanding anything. Everything is said to be voluntary. I'll now explain how this scheme works. As it became known today, Oman has already even submitted an official proposal to the United States of America and other Western allies about a new mechanism for using the Hormuz Strait. The document states that shipping companies must pay contributions and taxes to ensure the safety of navigation in the strait. The Omani side insists that these payments will be voluntary and are not a classic duty or transit fee. It is proposed to use the model of the Malacca and Singapore Straits as an example. For many years now, there has been a special fund where governments and private companies voluntarily contribute certain amounts to support the safety of navigation in this strait. However, the Iranian side interprets the agreements differently, and now one of Iran's high-ranking officials has stated that the payments should be mandatory. And then they will simply be divided equally between Iran and Oman. He says, "This is our shared strait. We will collect the money and split it 50-50 between the two of us." It's important to remember that before the war between the US and Iran, the Hormuz Strait remained open, which is important, as an international maritime route that ships could use absolutely free of charge. That's how it worked for many decades, and it turns out it was quite safe there. But that was before Donald Trump decided to attack Iran. However, during the hostilities, Iran effectively took control of the strait and blocked the movement of ships. This led to a sharp spike in global oil prices. As you may remember, they exceeded $100 per barrel, and fuel prices went up in many countries around the world. After the war ended, Tehran repeatedly stated that it intended to use its control over the strait as an economic tool. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi has already stated that the Hormuz Strait will never return to its pre-war status when shipping was completely free. Well, as they say, those were the days. Then Trump came. But Washington categorically does not support any attempts to monetize passage through the Hormuz Strait. But looking ahead, I can say that it might happen that Washington's opinion will not be taken into account. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio stated that the United States is against any payments regardless of what they are called, a duty, a fee, or a voluntary contribution. He said, "We don't care what you call it, but passage must be free." Но проход должен быть бесплатным. Earlier, U.S. President Donald Trump also called the idea of charging ships for passage through the Hormuz Strait unacceptable. Back in the spring, he even threatened Oman with military consequences if the country supported such initiatives. Despite this, American negotiators continue consultations with Muscat and hope to find a compromise. So, they are no longer rejecting it. Now they say, well, listen, it's not just Iran that wants this, Oman is also demanding it, so let's try to come to an agreement. Let me put it this way, in case you didn't understand, I'll make this point clear. Iran has now reached an agreement with Muscat and shifted all this dirty work onto Oman's shoulders. Like, it's not them who are actively pushing this idea. Now it's Oman's idea, so we need to negotiate. And here is Oman's foreign minister, Badr al-Busaidi, emphasizing that the country is not proposing to introduce a fee specifically for transit, since that would contradict international law. The Omanis say there are no mandatory payments. Instead, according to him, it's about funding services for ensuring the safety of navigation, dealing with accidents, and protecting the environment. Well, I won't repeat myself, but somehow before the war, everything worked. Everything was fine. And now it turns out money is needed for all of this. So, al-Busaidi noted that maintaining the strait in a safe condition requires significant expenses. But the trick is that the only threat in the Hormuz Strait is Iran, and it is precisely Iran together with Oman who will collect money to protect ships from the Iranian threat. Absurd? Of course. But this is exactly the scheme that both countries are now promoting. European diplomats admit that they don't like the very idea of new payments, but right now the main task is to make the possible mechanism such that it does not contradict international law. The Secretary General of the International Maritime Organization, Arsenio Dominguez, stated today that any mandatory fees would be illegal. At the same time, he allowed for the creation of voluntary fees if it works along the lines of what exists in the Strait of Malacca. So, in general, Europe is not against charging ships for passing through the Hormuz Strait. They're just looking for ways to name it so it doesn't look like extortion. And if they figure out how, and they already have, then most likely the Americans won't be able to counteract it. And in this context, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Saudi Arabia, Prince Faisal bin Farhan, gave a truly brilliant verdict on this whole situation. Here is his quote. Why should we agree to new rules in the Hormuz Strait just because a war has broken out? But Donald Trump doesn't have an answer to this question. And now, the main point. In Muscat, officials have already said that as Trump's envoys, Witkoff and Kushner, hold talks in Qatar. In the coming days, Iran and Oman plan to begin official negotiations on the future shipping regime in the Strait of Hormuz. This topic remains one of the key issues in the negotiations between the US and Iran after the signing of the Framework Peace Agreement. And if the parties do reach an agreement on a new financing mechanism, this could become the most significant change in the rules for using the Strait of Hormuz in recent decades. And it could significantly affect global trade. Because it is through this route that about 1/20th of global oil exports and significant volumes of liquefied natural gas pass. By the way, according to marine traffic, vessel movement in the Hormuz Strait is gradually increasing. Yesterday, 34 crossings were recorded, but this is still far from the pre-war average of about 100 daily crossings. Despite the increase in vessel traffic, security issues remain, which, by the way, Oman and Iran are supposedly going to insure against. The Joint Maritime Information Center stated on Tuesday evening that, quote, the level of maritime security threat in the Hormuz Strait has been raised to substantial. There is still an additional mine threat, and demining operations are ongoing. Merchant vessels are passing through the strait both via the southern Omani corridor and the northern route controlled by Iran. And here's what's funny. According to the Memorandum of Understanding that Donald Trump signed on June 17, the United States of America has until July 19 to completely lift the naval blockade of Iranian ports. And Iran, in response, is expected to make every effort to restore the cargo flow to pre-war levels during this same period. But it is clearly stated this is not guaranteed. That is, the Americans are required to lift the entire blockade, while the Iranians will make efforts to lift their own blockade as well. And so, according to the analysis by tanker trackers, after the official lifting of the blockade, which the US carried out 2 weeks ago, Iran has already exported about 50 million barrels of crude oil, while other Persian Gulf countries are having difficulties organizing their own exports. Because the Persian Gulf is now clogged with these tankers that just can't get out of the Strait of Hormuz. Today, a huge tanker also ran aground there, blocking part of the strait. And here is the main trap that Donald Trump fell into. The agreement from June 17 does not address whether Iran will ultimately retain control over the Strait of Hormuz. It is clearly stated there that ships will be able to pass for free for only 60 days, while Iran and its Persian Gulf neighbors negotiate a new agreement on the Strait of Hormuz, which means that Iran may be allowed to charge a fee. We can see where these negotiations are heading. Meanwhile, the Vice President of the United States of America, J.D. Vance, tried to tell us something, but honestly, I have to admit, I didn't understand what he was trying to say. Well, maybe you'll understand. J.D. Vance stated that there are still many cards to be put on the table in the negotiations with Iran. If Tehran, as Vance notes, responds correctly, then everyone will look back and say that everything started from a clean slate. Otherwise, if Iran acts poorly, the US, as Vance stated, still has many points of leverage to ensure that the outcome is favorable for America. Let me now provide the full quote from J.D. Vance. Everyone wants to say that it's all over. Or DMK Democrats and frankly even some Republicans say, well, this shows that Donald Trump backed down, while others say it's all over and the Iranians say this and that, this and that. And I would be extremely skeptical of everything that's being said right now. But the good news is that we have an administration, we have the President of the United States of America, Donald Trump, who is constantly trying to figure out how to get an advantage for the American people. I firmly believe that in the end, we will look back at this moment and say, we achieved a good result. This will require a lot of work, not only in negotiations, but in other areas as well. So, friends, if you understand what other cards Donald Trump still has regarding Iran and when he might play them, based on this statement by J.D. Vance, please write in the comments. Because I listened to Vance's statement several times and still couldn't figure out what he's getting at. He says that we have a super cool president who, get this, is constantly trying to figure out how to get an advantage for the American people. Trying to figure it out. So, he didn't have any strategy to begin with. When he started the war, did he understand what he was getting into? Or is he only now trying to figure out what to do next? Then he says, there are cards and we use them. What cards? Which ones? Where? If there were cards, we would have used them, but there aren't any. And we see that Iran is getting a bunch of, perks, all kinds of preferential treatment, while Trump is trying to figure out how to get an advantage for the American people. This is at the negotiation stage after how long? 2 months of war, even more than 2 months. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. If you want to support the work of this YouTube channel, you can do so with any donation using the links and details in the description of this video. It literally says, support the Alexei Pechin channel. Choose any method that's convenient for you. I will be grateful for any support you give. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.